Blood and chocolate shouldn't mix. The Romano family ruled the city's underbelly with iron fists and silenced pistols, but it was a simple plastic squeeze bottle of Hershey's syrup that broke an unbreakable curse. Little Lily Romano hadn't uttered a single syllable since the night she watched her mother die on the cold marble floors of their estate. Top-tier therapists failed. Bribery failed. Threats failed. It took a worn-out waitress in a neon-lit, grease-stained diner on 52nd Street to do the impossible. One hand-drawn chocolate heart on a stack of buttermilk pancakes changed the balance of power in the city forever. The rain in Boston had a way of cutting straight through to the bone, but inside Henderson's Blue Plate Diner, the air was thick with the comforting scent of burnt coffee and frying bacon. Cynthia Sasser wiped down the Formica counter with a damp rag, her shoulder aching from an 8-hour shift that had inexplicably stretched into 10. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. The diner was a sanctuary for the city's nocturnal ghosts, insomniacs, tired cab drivers, and those who simply had nowhere else to be. Cynthia was 24, surviving on tips and sheer stubbornness. She was trying to keep her younger brother's mounting medical bills from drowning them both. The diner was her life raft, and George Henderson, the gruff owner with a heart of gold, was her captain. The brass bell above the door chimed, shattering the low hum of the refrigerator. The diner fell instantly, terrifyingly silent. Cynthia looked up. The cold draft from the street swept in, bringing with it 3 figures who did not belong in a place that served $2 pie. 2 of the men were built like brick walls, wearing tailored dark suits that bulged slightly at the chest. But it was the man in the center who commanded the room. Matteo Romano. Even Cynthia, who made it a point to mind her own business, recognized the face. He was the heir to the Romano syndicate, a man whose name was whispered in back alleys and shouted in high society boardrooms. He possessed a sharp aristocratic profile, eyes the color of storm clouds, and an aura of such absolute authority that the 2 cab drivers in the corner booth immediately left cash on their table and hurried out the back door. But it wasn't the terrifying Mafia boss that caught Cynthia's eye. It was the little girl holding his hand. She looked no older than 8. She was dressed in an immaculate, pristine white wool coat, her dark hair braided perfectly, but her eyes were entirely hollow. They were the eyes of a ghost, vacant, unblinking, and lost in a world far removed from the diner. Matteo guided the girl to a booth in the back. His bodyguards, a silver-haired man named Declan and a younger, brutal-looking enforcer named Finn, took up positions by the door and the kitchen. George Henderson appeared from the back, his face completely drained of color. He looked at Cynthia, his hands trembling. "Cynthia, you take them. Don't make eye contact. Don't ask questions. Just get them what they want." Cynthia swallowed hard, smoothing her apron. She grabbed a fresh notepad and a pot of decaf, forcing her legs to carry her across the linoleum floor. As she approached, she noticed the stark contrast between the lethal, tense posture of the father and the absolute stillness of the child. "Good evening," Cynthia said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Matteo didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed solely on his daughter. "Water for me. Milk for Lily." His voice was a low baritone, smooth, but laced with an underlying warning. "Right away," Cynthia said. She looked at the little girl. "Are you hungry, sweetie? We have the best pancakes in the city." "She doesn't speak," Matteo interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp like a snapping whip. He finally looked at Cynthia, and the intensity in his grey eyes made her breath catch. "Bring her the pancakes. Plain. No butter." "Of course." Cynthia nodded, quickly retreating to the safety of the kitchen. When she brought the food back, the silence at the table was suffocating. Matteo was gently trying to coax the little girl to take her coat off, but Lily remained rigid, staring blankly at the salt shaker. Cynthia set the water and the milk down. Then she held the plate of hot buttermilk pancakes. She remembered a time when she was little after her own father had left, when her mother used to draw silly faces on her food to make her smile. Without overthinking it, Cynthia pulled the plastic squeeze bottle of chocolate syrup from the pocket of her apron. She always kept one handy for the kids who came in on Sunday mornings. Matteo's hand shot out, gripping Cynthia's wrist with terrifying speed. His grip was like a steel vice. "What are you doing?" he demanded softly. Cynthia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Finn and Declan instantly stepped forward, their hands slipping inside their jackets. "Just adding a little something," Cynthia whispered, refusing to break eye contact with the mob boss, even though her knees were shaking. "A little extra love. It's on the house." Matteo stared at her for a long, calculating second. Slowly, his grip loosened. He released her wrist, though his eyes never left her face. Cynthia exhaled a shaky breath, turned her attention to the silent little girl, and gently squeezed the bottle. With smooth, practiced motions, she drew a perfect, thick chocolate heart right in the center of the top pancake. "There you go, Lily," Cynthia said softly, sliding the plate in front of the girl. "Sometimes the dark things make the sweet things taste a little better." Cynthia turned to walk away. She had only made it 2 steps when a small, fragile sound stopped her dead in her tracks. "It's pretty." The voice was raspy, unused, and incredibly quiet. But in the dead silence of the diner, it rang out like a gunshot. Behind her, Cynthia heard a sudden sharp intake of breath. She turned around. Matteo Romano was frozen. The silver fork he had been holding clattered against the porcelain plate. He was staring at his daughter, his mouth slightly parted, his eyes wide with a shock so profound it looked like physical pain. Lily had picked up her fork. She was looking right at Cynthia. "Thank you," the little girl whispered. Matteo slowly turned his head to look at Cynthia. The lethal, untouchable Mafia boss was suddenly gone, replaced by a father whose universe had just shifted on its axis. The immediate aftermath of the chocolate heart felt like standing in the epicenter of a bomb blast. Matteo Romano stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the booth. For a terrifying second, Cynthia thought she had done something unforgivable. Finn and Declan had already closed the distance, standing like twin gargoyles waiting for a command. "What did you say to her?" Matteo's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the hair on the back of Cynthia's neck stand up. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. The scent of rain, expensive cedarwood cologne, and something inherently dangerous wrapped around her. I just drew a heart," Cynthia stammered, backing up until her hips hit the edge of the neighboring table. "I didn't mean any disrespect, sir." "She hasn't spoken in 6 months. Matteo said, his eyes scanning Cynthia's face as if trying to decipher a complex code. 6 months. 6 of the best pediatric psychiatrists in the country. Nothing. And you drew a heart." He reached into the breast pocket of his suit. Cynthia flinched, but he only withdrew a silver money clip. He peeled off $100 bills and dropped them onto the table next to the unfinished pancakes. "We will be back," Matteo stated. It wasn't a promise. It was a decree. He gently scooped Lily into his arms. The little girl rested her head against his shoulder, her eyes fluttering shut. Without another word, the Romano men swept out of the diner, leaving behind the chilling quiet and a waitress whose life had just irrevocably changed. Over the next 3 weeks, Matteo kept his word. Every Tuesday and Thursday, precisely at 11 p.m., the black Lincoln Navigator would pull up to the curb. The routine was always the same. Declan would enter first, clear the room with a glare, and then Matteo and Lily would walk in. George Henderson practically had a heart attack each time, retreating to his office and leaving Cynthia to manage the front. At first, Lily would only speak to Cynthia. When Cynthia brought her milk, Lily would say, "Hello, Cynthia." When Cynthia drew different shapes on her pancakes, a star, a smiley face, a flower, Lily would quietly guess what they were. Matteo watched this dynamic with a hawk-like intensity. He would sit across from his daughter, sipping his black coffee, his eyes tracking Cynthia's every movement. He began to ask questions, not casually, but like an interrogator gathering intelligence. "Why are you working the graveyard shift?" he asked one rainy Thursday, his elbows resting on the table hands, steepled together. Cynthia poured him a fresh cup. "Because the tips are better, and I need the money." "For what?" "That's private, Mr. Romano." "I don't like mysteries, Cynthia." He said her name, slowly tasting the syllables. "It's your brother, Thomas. He needs a lung transplant." Cynthia froze, the coffee pot hovering in the air. "You investigated me. I investigate anyone who gets within 10 feet of my daughter." Matteo replied smoothly, his tone unapologetic. "Your father ran out when you were 10. Your mother passed away 3 years ago. You dropped out of nursing school to take care of Thomas. You are drowning in debt." Anger flared in Cynthia's chest momentarily, overriding her fear of the man. "You have no right to look into my life." "I have every right to protect my own." Matteo counted, his eyes darkening. He leaned forward. "Come work for me, as Lily's nanny. I will clear your brother's debt by morning. I will put him at the top of the transplant list at Chicago Med. You will never have to smell stale grease again." Cynthia looked at him. Truly looked at him. Beneath the tailored suits and the terrifying reputation, she saw a man desperate to keep the tiny thread connecting him to his daughter from snapping. She had learned from the diner gossip why Lily had stopped speaking. 6 months ago, a rival syndicate had ambushed the Romano estate. Matteo's wife, Isabella, had hidden Lily in a closet before she was gunned down. Lily had watched the entire thing through the slats of the wooden door. Cynthia felt a deep pang of sympathy for the girl, but she knew the reality of Matteo's world. It was a world of blood and shadows, and once you stepped in, you never stepped out. "No," Cynthia said firmly. Matteo's eyebrows rose. It was clearly a word he rarely heard. "Excuse me. I'm a waitress, Mr. Romano, not a mobster's employee. I appreciate what you're offering for my brother, but I won't owe a debt to the Mafia." For a long moment, Matteo just stared at her. The silence stretched thick and dangerous. Declan shifted nervously by the door. Then, incredibly, the corner of Matteo's mouth twitched upward in a shadow of a smile. "You're either incredibly brave, Cynthia Sasser, or entirely foolish," he murmured, taking a sip of his coffee. "But we'll see." The rejection didn't stop the visits. If anything, they became more frequent. The diner became a bizarre neutral zone, a fragile bubble where the Don of the Romano family could just be a father. Cynthia found herself looking forward to the chime of the door. She started setting aside the best cut of pie for Matteo, and she noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way he would subtly position his body to shield her if a drunk patron got too loud. But the bubble was made of glass, and outside the diner, a war was brewing. It was a cold Monday night, a rare evening when Matteo and Lily hadn't visited. Cynthia's shift ended at 2 a.m. She bundled up in her worn woolen coat, waved goodbye to George, and stepped out into the biting wind of the alleyway behind the diner. The street light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the brick walls. Cynthia fished her keys out of her purse, her mind on the hospital bills sitting on her kitchen counter. "Miss Sasser?" The voice came from the darkness near the dumpsters. Cynthia jumped her keys, slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the wet asphalt. A man stepped into the dim light. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit like Matteo's men. He wore a heavy leather jacket, and half of his face was obscured by a jagged, poorly healed scar that ran from his ear to his jaw. 2 other men materialized behind him, blocking the exit to the street. Cynthia's blood ran cold. "Who are you? What do you want? I don't have any money." "We don't want your money, sweetheart," the scarred man said, his accent thick with a harsh, guttural rasp. This was Victor Calloway's crew, the Irish syndicate that was slowly losing the turf war against the Romanos. "We just want to send a message to a mutual friend, Matteo." "I don't know what you're talking about," Cynthia said, stepping back until her back hit the cold metal of the diner's back door. It was locked. The man chuckled a wet, ugly sound. "Word on the street is the cold-blooded Don has gone soft. Spends his nights eating cheap pie, playing house with a little waitress who got the mute kid talking. My boss, Mr. Calloway, he finds that fascinating. He thinks maybe Matteo loves that little girl too much. Thinks maybe he cares about the waitress too." He pulled a switchblade from his pocket. The metallic snick echoed loudly in the alley. "Tell Romano he gives up the Southside docks by Friday," the man hissed, taking a step closer, the tip of the blade catching the flickering streetlight. "Or the next time he comes in for pancakes, he's going to find his favorite waitress with a smile carved from ear to ear." He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The pure, unadulterated malice in his eyes was enough to make Cynthia's knees buckle. The men backed away, melting back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Cynthia shaking uncontrollably against the brick wall. The next evening, Cynthia was a wreck. She dropped 2 plates poured regular coffee instead of decaf and jumped every time the diner bell rang. At exactly 11 p.m., the black navigator arrived. When Matteo walked in with Lily, his predatory instincts flared instantly. He took one look at Cynthia's pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the slight tremor in her hands as she poured water. He didn't sit down. He handed Lily off to Declan. "Take her to the booth. Order for her." Matteo walked straight behind the counter, ignoring George Henderson's panicked squawk, and gripped Cynthia's elbow. He bypassed the kitchen and marched her directly into the small, cramped break room in the back, kicking the door shut behind them. The room smelled of bleach and old mops. Matteo backed her against the wall, not violently, but with an intensity that left no room for escape. "Who touched you?" he demanded, his voice a lethal vibrating growl. "No one," Cynthia lied, looking away, staring at his expensive silk tie. "I'm just tired, Mr. Romano." Matteo brought his hands up, framing her face, his thumbs gently brushing her cheekbones. The touch was shocking, warm, calloused, and surprisingly tender. "Look at me, Cynthia." She met his eyes, and the raw fear she had been holding back finally cracked her facade. Tears welled up, spilling over her lashes. Calloway's men, she whispered, her voice breaking. In the alley last night. They said to tell you to give up the Southside docks. Or they would. She couldn't finish the sentence. The change in Matteo was terrifying. The tender man vanished, replaced by the monster the city feared. His eyes turned completely dead, the irises darkening to the color of asphalt. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Declan!" Matteo roared, his voice shaking the thin walls of the break room. The door burst open. Declan stood there, gun already drawn. "Call Finn. Tell him to take a team to O'Bannon's pub. Burn it to the ground," Matteo ordered coldly. "And find the man with the scar. Keep him breathing until I get there." "Understood, boss?" Declan nodded, immediately pulling out his phone. Cynthia gasped, grabbing Matteo's lapels. "No, Matteo, you can't just start a war over this. They didn't hurt me. They threatened what is mine," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. He looked down at her hands gripping his suit, then back up to her eyes. "You said no to my protection, Cynthia. You wanted to stay out of my world." He reached out his hand, sliding to the back of her neck, his fingers curling into her hair. He pulled her flush against his chest. Cynthia could feel the heavy, cold weight of the firearm, holstered beneath his jacket, resting right against her racing heart. "You don't have a choice anymore," Matteo whispered, his breath ghosting over her lips. "Go pack a bag. You and your brother are moving into my estate tonight." "I can't just leave my life," Cynthia protested, though her resistance was melting under the overwhelming force of his presence. "Your life as you knew it ended the second you drew that chocolate heart," Matteo stated, stepping back and straightening his cuffs, the ruthless Mafia boss fully in command. "You are coming with me. If Calloway wants a war, I will drown him in blood. But I am not losing you." The transition from the neon-lit, grease-stained reality of Henderson's Blue Plate Diner to the Romano estate in Brookline was like stepping onto another planet. Within 3 hours of the alleyway confrontation, Matteo's men had packed Cynthia's meager belongings into black duffel bags. More importantly, Matteo had bypassed miles of bureaucratic red tape with a few hushed phone calls, having Cynthia's 19-year-old brother Thomas transferred from the understaffed public ward at Boston Medical Center to a private, heavily guarded suite at Massachusetts General Hospital. Thomas, frail and fighting a losing battle against idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, had looked at the grim-faced men in tailored suits moving his oxygen tanks and simply asked Cynthia, "Are we in the mob now, sis?" Cynthia hadn't known whether to laugh or cry. By 4 a.m., Cynthia found herself standing in the grand foyer of Matteo's home. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress masked as architectural brilliance. The walls were lined with imported Italian marble, and a massive chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a cold, brilliant light over the curving double staircase. Outside the perimeter was patrolled by men carrying concealed tactical weapons, their earpieces glowing faintly in the pre-dawn mist. "It's too much, Matteo," Cynthia whispered, her worn canvas sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished floor. She hugged her arms around herself, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her faded jeans and oversized sweater. Matteo, who had shed his suit jacket and tie, looked exhausted. The lethal energy from the diner had dialed back into a simmering heavy vigilance. "There is no too much when it comes to keeping you and my daughter breathing, Cynthia. Calloway crossed a line tonight. Until I erase that line, and him along with it, you don't leave these gates." He assigned her a suite on the second floor, right across from Lily's room. The bed was larger than Cynthia's entire previous apartment, outfitted with Egyptian cotton sheets and a mahogany headboard. But despite the luxury, the heavy reinforced locks on the heavy oak doors reminded her exactly what this place was: a beautiful gilded cage. The first week was a tense negotiation of boundaries. Cynthia refused to sit idle. She rejected the attempts of the estate's stoic housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, to wait on her. Instead, Cynthia took over the kitchen, replacing the private chef's complicated Michelin star menus with the comfort food Lily actually ate. The smell of baking bread, roasting chicken, and of course buttermilk pancakes slowly began to permeate the sterile, cold air of the mansion. Lily thrived. Away from the pressure of doctors and the shadow of the city, the little girl began to open up like a flower to the sun. She still didn't speak to anyone but Cynthia, and occasionally whispered to her father, but she started communicating in other ways. Cynthia bought her a set of expensive charcoal pencils and thick sketch pads, and Lily spent hours in the sunroom drawing. Matteo was a ghost during the day, consumed by the escalating turf war. Cynthia would see the news reports on the television in the kitchen, a warehouse fire by the docks, an unexplained explosion at an Irish pub in South Boston. Every headline was a stark reminder of the blood on Matteo's hands. One Tuesday night, a storm rolled off the Atlantic, battering the estate's massive windows with heavy rain. Cynthia couldn't sleep. She padded downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of warm milk, wearing an oversized grey Harvard sweatshirt she'd borrowed from Thomas's bag. She froze in the doorway. Matteo was sitting at the massive granite island in the dark, the only light coming from the lightning flashes outside. A half-empty bottle of Macallan 18 sat in front of him. He looked up as she entered. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing thick, corded forearms covered in fading ink. But it was his hands that made Cynthia's breath catch. His knuckles were split, bruised a deep, angry purple, and a dark smear of dried blood stained his left cuff. "You should be asleep," he rasped, his voice thick with exhaustion and whiskey. Cynthia didn't run. She walked to the sink, dampened a clean dish towel with warm water, and approached him. "So should you." She reached out gently, taking his bruised hand. Matteo flinched, not from pain, but from the sudden stark contrast of her soft skin against his battered knuckles. He let her clean the cuts, his stormy grey eyes fixed entirely on her face. "I'm a monster, Cynthia," he whispered into the quiet kitchen, the confession heavy with self-loathing. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be touching me." "I'm touching a father who is terrified of losing his little girl," Cynthia replied softly, carefully dabbing away the blood. "And a man who just paid off my brother's medical debt today. Thomas is on the transplant list at Chicago Med Matteo. You did that." "I did it with dirty money," he countered bitterly. "Everything I touch is ruined. Isabella, she hated this life. She begged me to leave it, and because I didn't, she bled out on the floor upstairs." He pulled his hand away from hers, burying his face in his palms. Cynthia saw the absolute crushing weight of his guilt. Without thinking, she stepped into the V of his spread knees and wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, pulling his head to her chest. Matteo went rigid for a second before a shudder racked his massive frame. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her sweatshirt, holding on to her like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. In the dark, silent kitchen, the terrifying Mafia dawn finally broke, and Cynthia held the pieces together. 2 weeks later, the uneasy peace inside the estate shattered not by a bullet, but by a piece of charcoal. It was late afternoon. Thomas had been officially matched with a donor, and the medical transport to Chicago was scheduled for the following morning. Cynthia was practically vibrating with relief and anxiety. She sat in the sunroom with Lily, trying to distract herself by helping the girl sketch the manicured gardens outside. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" Cynthia asked, peering over the top of her coffee mug. Lily didn't look up. Her small hand moved frantically over the heavy paper, pressing the charcoal down so hard it squeaked. She was not drawing the flowers. Cynthia frowned, setting her mug down and leaning closer. The image was dark, chaotic, filled with sharp, jagged lines. It was a perspective drawn from near the floor, looking upward through what looked like the wooden slats of a closet door. Cynthia's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. It was a drawing of the night Isabella died. "Lily," Cynthia breathed, her voice trembling. "Do we have to draw this? We can draw the horses." Lily shook her head stubbornly. She grabbed a red-colored pencil, the only splash of color on the page, and began aggressively coloring a pool on the floor. Then she picked up her black charcoal again and focused entirely on a specific detail in the center of the page. It was a man's hand holding a suppressed pistol aimed downward. But Lily wasn't focusing on the gun. She was meticulously shading a wristwatch on the man's wrist. It was incredibly detailed for an 8-year-old. A square face, a heavy metal band, and a distinct jagged crack running diagonally across the glass bezel. Cynthia stared at the drawing, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. She knew that watch. She had seen it less than an hour ago. It belonged to Silas Mateo's second-in-command. Silas, who managed the estate's security. Silas, who was currently standing guard at the front gate. "Lily," Cynthia whispered, gripping the edge of the table. "The man who hurt Mummy, did he wear this watch?" Lily stopped drawing. She looked up at Cynthia, her hollow eyes welling with tears, and gave a single, terrified nod. It hadn't been an ambush by a rival syndicate. It had been an inside job. Silas had let the killers in. Or perhaps he had pulled the trigger himself. And Victor Calloway had simply taken the credit to boost his reputation. Panic seized Cynthia's throat. She grabbed the sketchbook, scooped Lily into her arms, and bolted from the sunroom. She had to find Mateo. She found him in his massive mahogany-paneled office at the end of the East Wing. He was on the phone, his face carved from stone, barking orders to Declan about securing the docks. "Mateo!" Cynthia burst into the room, locking the heavy doors behind her. Mateo hung up the phone instantly, taking in her pale face and the trembling little girl in her arms. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides. "What is it? What's wrong?" Cynthia shoved the sketchbook into his chest. "Look at it. Mateo. Look at what she drew." Mateo looked down at the chaotic black and red lines. His eyes tracked the perspective, the pool of red, and finally landed on the watch. Cynthia watched the exact moment the realization hit him. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The color drained from Mateo's face, replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness. "Silas." Mateo whispered the name, sounding like a curse. "He was there, Mateo. Lily saw him." Before Mateo could reach for the gun holstered at his waist, the entire estate plunged into pitch blackness. The heavy thrum of the central generators died. The security system had been cut. Mateo's instincts snapped into place instantly. He grabbed Cynthia's arm, hauling her and Lily behind his massive oak desk. He drew his Sig Sauer, his eyes scanning the darkness of the office. "Listen to me carefully." Mateo commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper right by Cynthia's ear. "The backup generators take exactly 60 seconds to kick in. Silas knows this. He cut the power to blind the exterior cameras and unlock the biometric locks. He's coming for us," Cynthia realized, holding Lily tightly against her chest, feeling the little girl's heart hammering like a trapped bird. "He's coming to finish what he started, to take the syndicate," Matteo corrected grimly, "and to eliminate the only witness." He looked at Lily. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the office, heavy, deliberate boots on the marble floor. "Cynthia," Matteo said, pressing a small cold metal object into her free hand. It was a spare magazine. "There is a panic room behind the bookshelf on the left. The code is Isabella's birthday, April 12th, 88. Get inside. Do not come out until you hear my voice." Matteo. "No, there are too many of them," Cynthia cried softly, terrified of losing the man she had unexpectedly come to care for. "I'm the Don of this family." Matteo growled softly, a terrifying fire igniting in his grey eyes. "No one touches what is mine." He shoved them toward the bookshelf just as the heavy oak doors of the office groaned under the weight of someone trying to force them open. The heavy oak doors of Matteo's office didn't just open, they exploded inward. The splintering crack of reinforced wood, giving way, echoed like cannon fire through the pitch-black estate, a violent announcement that the impregnable fortress had fallen. From the suffocating safety of the hidden panic room behind the library's massive bookshelf, Cynthia clamped her trembling hands over Lily's ears. Her own heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs, loud enough that she feared the men outside could hear it through the steel. The reinforced walls of the safe room muffled the immediate chaos, reducing the shouts and shattering glass to heavy, vibrating thuds. The only light in the cramped space came from the bank of security monitors, glowing faintly in the corner. They broadcasted the nightmare unfolding in the office through high-definition infrared, painting the intruders in ghostly thermal whites and aggressive reds. Lily was curled into a tight ball on the floor, her small hands fisted in Cynthia's oversized Harvard sweatshirt. Cynthia pulled the girl closer, rocking her gently. "It's okay, baby," Cynthia whispered, pressing a desperate, lingering kiss to the little girl's perfectly braided hair. She hated the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. "Your daddy is the strongest man in the city." On the center screen, the thermal imaging showed Silas, the head of security, the traitor who had orchestrated Isabella's murder, stepping cautiously into the ruined office. He was flanked by 3 heavily armed mercenaries, outfitted in full tactical gear. Their suppressed submachine guns swept the darkness, the red laser sights slicing through the lingering dust of the shattered doors. They moved with the terrifying precision of a hit squad that expected an easy execution. They never saw Matteo coming. The Don of the Romano family had not cowered behind his desk. He had used the darkness to ascend to the upper gallery of the 2-story library. As the last mercenary passed beneath the wrought iron balcony, Matteo dropped from the shadows like a stone. In one fluid, brutal motion, Matteo neutralized the man. He snapped the mercenary's neck and stripped the weapon from his slack hands before the body even made a sound against the marble floor. The heavy thud alerted the others, but it was too late. A violent, chaotic firefight instantly erupted in the dark. Muzzle flashes illuminated the grand mahogany-paneled office in strobes of violent yellow, casting monstrous shadows against the walls. Cynthia watched the monitor with her breath trapped in her throat. She had only ever seen the tender father who ate cheap pie, or the exhausted man seeking comfort in her kitchen. Now she was watching the apex predator of the Boston underworld. Matteo moved with a lethal grace that defied his massive size. He used the heavy antique furniture for cover, systematically dismantling the squad that had come to put him in the ground. A bullet shattered the glass display case mere inches from Matteo's head. showering him in crystalline shards. But he didn't even flinch. He returned fire with absolute terrifying accuracy. Lily whimpered, burying her face deeper into Cynthia's chest, trembling uncontrollably as the muffled concussions of gunfire vibrated through the floorboards. But the monitors showed a truth Cynthia could not ignore. Matteo was winning the battle in his office, but he was losing the war for his home. Switching her gaze to the exterior feeds, Cynthia felt the blood turn to ice in her veins. Dozens of heavily armed men were pouring through the estate's shattered front doors. The perimeter had been completely and utterly breached. Declan and Finn were fighting a desperate losing battle in the West Wing corridors, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The infrared cameras caught a distinct hulking figure stepping casually over the ruined threshold of the main foyer. Even in the grainy thermal feed, Cynthia recognized the heavy, swaggering gait and the outline of the thick wool overcoat. It was Victor Calloway himself, flanked by a dozen of his most hardened Irish enforcers. This was no longer just an assassination attempt fueled by a turf dispute. It was a hostile takeover. Calloway barked a silent order on the screen, pointing his thick finger toward the grand staircase. His men immediately pivoted, moving with military efficiency. They were heading for the second floor. They were heading for the East Wing. Cynthia's mind raced, calculating the grim mathematics of their survival. Matteo was currently pinned down behind his desk, by Silas trading shots in a bitter stalemate. If Calloway and his dozen men reached the office, Matteo would be flanked and slaughtered in seconds. And once Matteo was dead, it would only be a matter of time before Silas, who knew the estate's secrets better than anyone, bypassed the panic room's biometric locks to eliminate the only witness to his treason. Cynthia looked down at her own trembling, pale hands. For 24 years, she had buried the truth of who she really was. Her mother Mary, a fiercely independent and terrified woman, had fled the ruthless grip of the Irish mob in the dead of night. She had changed her name, scrubbed her history, and hidden her only daughter in the grimy, forgotten slums of South Boston to protect her from the generational violence. Cynthia had grown up believing she was nothing more than a penniless waitress struggling to pay medical bills. But the blood running through her veins was older, deeper, and far more dangerous than any superficial rivalry in the city. She wasn't just Cynthia Sasser. She was Cynthia Rose Calloway. She was Victor Calloway's biological niece. And by the ancient, archaic, and unyielding laws of their specific syndicate, she was the rightful direct line heir to the entire Irish Empire. The very heir Victor had spent a decade ruthlessly hunting down to secure his own illegitimate claim. The realization hit her not with fear, but with a sudden, profound clarity. The terrified waitress vanished, replaced by an iron core she hadn't known she possessed. "Lily," Cynthia said, her voice dropping the soothing maternal cadence and taking on a sudden absolute steadiness. "I need you to stay exactly here. Do not make a sound until I come back." Lily looked up, her hollow eyes wide and dilated with sheer panic in the dim light. She reached out with both hands, grabbing thick fistfuls of Cynthia's sweater. "No," the little girl rasped, her unused voice thick and wet with tears. "Don't leave." Cynthia gently but firmly pried the little girl's fingers away, holding her small hands for one last second. "I have to, sweetie, to save your dad." She met Lily's terrified gaze, pouring every ounce of certainty she had into the promise. "I promise I will come back. I promise on the chocolate heart." Cynthia stood up. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of her oversized sweatshirt, as if it were a suit of armor. She walked to the heavy steel door, punched in the override code on the keypad, and gripped the handle. The heavy steel door slid open with a soft hiss, and Cynthia stepped out into the chaotic, gun-smoke-filled darkness of the office. The smell of cordite and copper immediately assaulted her senses. Matteo had just incapacitated the traitor. He had Silas pinned forcefully beneath his knee, the barrel of his Sig Sauer pressed firmly against the man's temple. Silas was bleeding, gasping for breath under the Don's crushing weight. But the victory was agonizingly short-lived. The heavy synchronized footfalls of Victor Calloway's men echoed loudly down the marble hallway. A second later, the ruined doorway of the office was flooded with the blinding aggressive beams of tactical flashlights. "Well, well, well." Victor Calloway's raspy, gravel-filled voice echoed through the destroyed room. He stepped into the harsh light, his scarred face twisted into a grotesque smile of triumph. He looked down at the scene with malicious satisfaction. The great Matteo Romano, brought to his knees in his own castle, a fitting end. Matteo didn't flinch. He didn't even blink against the blinding lights. He kept his weapon trained precisely on the traitor beneath him, even though a dozen automatic rifles were now aimed directly at his own chest. "You're a dead man, Victor," Matteo growled, his voice a lethal vibrating promise. "My men will burn your territory to the ash." "Your men are dead or dying, Matteo," Victor sneered casually, waving a hand to dismiss the threat. "It's over. Give me the girl and I'll make your end quick." "Over my dead body," Matteo stated, his finger tightening imperceptibly on the trigger. "That can be arranged," Victor said, casually raising his own heavy revolver. Cynthia stepped forward from the shadows of the bookcase. "Put the gun down, Uncle Victor." The voice was clear, perfectly steady, and rang with an absolute chilling authority that cut through the suffocating tension like a straight razor. Every man in the room froze. Matteo's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes widening in horror as he saw Cynthia exposing herself. Victor Calloway lowered his weapon a fraction of an inch, squinting furiously into the shadows. Cynthia walked slowly, deliberately, into the intersecting beams of the flashlights. She didn't look like a terrified civilian caught in a crossfire. She stood tall, her spine perfectly straight, her chin raised. Her eyes blazed with a fierce, aristocratic fire that perfectly mirrored the dangerous men surrounding her. She placed herself squarely between the firing squad and Matteo. "Who the hell are you?" One of Victor's lieutenants, a scarred man named Liam, spat, raising his rifle barrel toward her chest. Cynthia didn't even blink. "Lower your weapon, Liam, unless you want to lose that hand," she commanded, her voice dropping to a deadly, icy calm. Victor Calloway stared at her, his scarred face contorted in confusion, which slowly melted into a creeping, dawning shock. He looked at the shape of her eyes, the proud set of her jaw, the unmistakable facial structure that mirrored his own brother's. All the bravado completely bled out of his posture. "It can't be," Victor whispered, taking a staggering half-step backward. "Mary's girl, Cynthia Rose Calloway." Cynthia stated clearly, using the full name she hadn't spoken aloud since she was a 10-year-old child. The syllables echoed in the silent, ruined office like a heavy gavel strike. "The rightful heir to the Northside Syndicate, and you are trespassing in my home." A low, frantic murmur of disbelief rippled instantly through the ranks of the Irish enforcers. In their brutal world, bloodline wasn't just a rule. It was religion. Victor had only ever ruled as a regent, claiming the main family line had been entirely wiped out. Cynthia's sudden, undeniable existence upended the entire hierarchy of their world in a matter of seconds. "You're a waitress," Victor stammered desperately, his grip on his gun faltering as he looked around at his shifting men. "You're a nobody." "I am the woman who is going to dismantle your regime," Cynthia said softly, holding his gaze with unwavering intensity. She slowly turned her head to look directly at the heavily armed men standing behind Victor. "By the laws of our family, the regency ends the moment the heir steps forward. Stand down, or you are committing treason against the Calloway blood." The silence that followed was agonizing heavy with the weight of shifting loyalties. Matteo watched Cynthia from his position on the floor, utterly mesmerized and terrified in equal measure. Slowly, deliberately, one of the older veteran Irish enforcers near the back lowered the barrel of his rifle to point at the floor. Then the man next to him did the same. Within 30 excruciating seconds, the entire strike team had their weapons pointed at the marble tiles, stepping away from Victor and looking to Cynthia for their next command. Victor Calloway was left standing completely alone in the center of the room, his stolen empire crumbling to dust around him, simply because a diner waitress had finally decided to speak her true name. The aftermath of the siege did not just rewrite the underworld of the eastern seaboard, it shattered it entirely. The power vacuum left by the sudden, indisputable emergence of the true Calloway heir sent shockwaves through the syndicates, but Cynthia refused to take the bloody throne. In a clandestine meeting heavily guarded by Matteo's men, she sat across a mahogany table from the trembling remnants of the Irish lieutenants. With a few swift signatures on legally binding trust documents, Cynthia systematically dismantled the empire that had haunted her mother's past. She transferred the syndicate's vast portfolio of legitimate real estate and front businesses into an irrevocable medical trust. Victor Calloway stripped of his men his territory, and his terrifying reputation was quietly escorted to a private jet bound for Dublin. He left with nothing but the heavy wool overcoat on his back, and a stern, chilling warning from Matteo that a return would mean his immediate end. As for the traitor Silas, who had orchestrated the nightmare that cost Isabella her life, he was silently handed over to Declan and Finn. Cynthia never asked what happened in the dark, soundproof basement of the estate that night, and Matteo, bearing the solemn duty of a grieving husband and a ruthless don, never volunteered the information. That chapter of betrayal was closed in blood and absolute silence. 3 weeks later, the air in Chicago was crisp, biting, and entirely free of the suffocating shadows of Boston. Cynthia stood by the expansive, frost-rimmed window of a private high-security recovery suite at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Outside, heavy white flakes of snow drifted lazily over the dark, freezing expanse of Lake Michigan. Inside, the rhythmic, steady beep of a heart monitor filled the sterile room, a beautiful mechanical symphony of life. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and Dr. Jonathan Arris, a renowned pulmonary specialist with kind, tired eyes, stepped into the room. He flipped through the thick medical chart in his hands before looking up at Cynthia, a genuine, wide smile breaking across his face. "The extubation was flawless, Miss Sasser," Dr. Arris announced, his voice carrying the weight of a miracle. "Thomas's body has fully accepted the donor lungs. His oxygen saturation is perfect. The surgery was a complete, undeniable success. He is going to live a long, healthy life." Cynthia pressed her trembling hands over her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. The crushing weight she had carried since she was a teenager, the grueling diner shifts, the mounting bills, the paralyzing fear of losing her only family, evaporated into the cold Chicago air. Moments after the doctor departed to check on the surgical ward, the suite door opened again. The air in the room shifted, warming instantly. Matteo walked in, wearing a sleek, tailored black cashmere overcoat that still managed to make him look dangerously imposing, even in a hospital setting. Yet the lethal edge that usually defined the Romano Don was entirely absent. He held a small, familiar plastic squeeze bottle in his hand. Beside him trotted Lily. Her cheeks flushed a vibrant pink from the biting wind outside, securely clutching a large, grease-spotted paper bag from a local bakery. Matteo crossed the room in 3 long strides, his stormy grey eyes soft, entirely stripped of their heavy armor. He didn't say a single word. He simply wrapped his large, powerful arm around Cynthia's waist, pulling her flush against his side, and buried his face in the crook of her neck. Cynthia leaned fully into his solid strength, wrapping her arms tightly around his broad shoulders. She finally let out a long, shuddering breath, a breath she felt she had been holding for months. "He's going to be okay," Cynthia whispered fiercely against the cold lapel of Matteo's coat, the tears finally falling freely. "He's really going to be okay." "I told you," Matteo murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her chest as he pressed a tender kiss to her temple. "I always protect what is mine." He pulled back slightly, his hands resting warmly on her waist as he looked down into her eyes. The terrifying Don of the Romano family looked at the former waitress with absolute unfiltered reverence. "And you, Cynthia Calloway, are you okay?" Cynthia offered a soft, watery smile, reaching up to gently trace the line of his jaw. "I'm Cynthia Sasser," she corrected softly, her voice steady and resolute. The other girl stepped out of the shadows just long enough to burn them down. "She's permanently retired." A sharp tug on the hem of Cynthia's jeans broke the heavy, beautiful moment. Lily had diligently unpacked the bakery bag on the small hospital table, revealing a towering stack of warm, incredibly fluffy buttermilk pancakes on a flimsy paper plate. The little girl held the plastic bottle of Hershey's syrup up to Cynthia, her hollow eyes now bright and brimming with life. "Your turn," Lily said. Her voice was no longer a raspy, fragile whisper, but clear, confident, and startlingly sweet. Cynthia smiled, her heart swelling until it physically ached. She took the plastic bottle, feeling the familiar weight of it in her hand. With a smooth, practiced motion, she drew a large, perfect, thick chocolate heart right over the top of the steaming pancakes. Lily looked down at the hand-drawn heart, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking across her face. Then she looked up at Cynthia. The little girl reached out her small arms, wrapping tightly around Cynthia's waist, burying her face into Cynthia's sweater. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. Matteo's breath caught sharply in his throat. He looked at Cynthia, his grey eyes shining with a raw, overwhelming emotion that defied all language. Slowly he reached out, wrapping his massive arms around both of the girls, securing his entire world safely against his chest. In the quiet, pristine warmth of that hospital room, the Romano family found their true salvation, proving that the sweetest things in life are often born from the darkest shadows.